What's up, everybody, and welcome to another Sunny review. And I'm excited to bring this review as I had been looking forward to seeing our first big MMORPG on the Nintendo Switch. And as a veteran of these types of games for the last 15 years, I was happy to get DC Universe here on our favorite console. But in this review, I'm going to be covering some of the general mechanics of the game, how it runs on docked and handheld mode, how the cash shop and the monetization work on this free-to-play title, and give a final score and give my thoughts in the end if you should invest your time and possibly your money in DC Universe Online. To get started, DC Universe Online is a MMORPG that first released in January 2011 on the PCs and PlayStation 3 and later got ported to the PS4 and Xbox One, and now it's on the Nintendo Switch. And if you're not familiar with what an MMORPG is, it's a massive multiplayer online role-playing game in which you will inhabit a huge world with other players just like yourself at the very same time. You can team up with each other to face quests or dungeons, or in the case of DC Universe Online, you can even fight against each other in player versus player battles as either the heroes or the villains. The story here is that in the future, Brainiac will take over the world and kill a lot of the heroes. So Lex Luthor comes up with a plan and survives this apocalypse and manages to steal some data from Brainiac that he had been acquiring from the heroes to make his own super meta-human army in the future. Then Luthor steals his data in the form of exobytes, goes back in the past and releases these exobytes into the atmosphere onto the normal humans, thus creating many superheroes and villains, which ends up being you, the player. You will then be trained by either the Justice League if you're a hero or Luthor if you're a villain. This was all done to try to make it to where you understood why there's so many villains and heroes running around in the game and in the DC universe. And when you start off, you'll first be creating your character and choosing various powers and fighting types, as well as if you will be a hero or a villain, the two different factions in the game. And as far as the powers, these can range from earth, sorcery, ice, fire, and many more that are unfortunately locked behind a paywall. Then you can choose your fighting style, and that can range from using dual pistols to martial arts to two-handed weapons to dual wield or a bow. So essentially you can combine your superhero powers with your fighting type. For example, you can be an ice shooting dual pistol hero or a fire based hero who uses a bow. So the possibilities of the type of villain or hero you want to create are vast, and you will definitely get that sense of uniqueness running around the world among your fellow superheroes or villains. As for the controls and gameplay, you'll be leveling and questing throughout your adventure to level 30. When you hit certain levels, you will be gaining skill points and new powers to unlock. You will set up your powers via the UI at the bottom, which will determine what buttons you press for which power you assign it to. When you're hitting with your basic attacks, you'll be using the X and Y button. The one is for melee and the other is for basic ranged attack. Then you will hold down either the left or right trigger to use your powers and abilities while pressing B, A, Y, or X, depending on which skill you have assigned to which button. If all of this sounds too complicated at first, don't worry, as the game assigns the abilities for you and you can learn button mapping that way. Eventually you'll get more comfortable with the UI and you will be able to adjust on which buttons to set your abilities on. There is also an auto targeting system here, which frankly I wasn't a huge fan of, as sometimes it didn't stay locked in like I wanted to and it was a bit finicky. But you'll have a plethora of abilities to unlock and use at your disposal here, with different powers doing different things like stunning your enemy or doing an area of effect attack which can hit multiple enemies at a time. In my case, my superhero was a magic user who healed his allies and himself, so I had the abilities assigned to make sure I kept myself alive and my fellow villains if they started to die. Outside of the targeting though, DC Universe I feel does a good job here with the controls. Flying, after I got the hang of it, worked really well, and combat started to feel easy. As you can tell, this game has had almost a decade worth of polish on the consoles. Which brings me to my next point. Now, this is my first MMORPG I have played seriously on a console, as I've only played this genre on a PC for the last 15 years. And one of my biggest worries was how the game interface would work, because MMORPGs are easily one of the more complicated types of games to handle in terms of mechanics at play. But I was pleasantly surprised at how easy this was for me to pick up. Now, you won't have a perfect system in place because you can't navigate a menu anywhere near as good as you can with a mouse, but everything was very clear and accessible. You can scroll with the trigger buttons to your inventory or other menus. Equipping gear and taking off was very simple and easy, but my two biggest gripes I had was switching between the menu categories at times lagged a bit and was slightly slightly slow, and the second was queuing up for a dungeon was a tad bit complicated, as you had to put in a specific dungeon in the queue, select it again, and then put your role. I feel this needs to be easier, as new people coming into this genre and this type of game will never access dungeon because there's just too much to click here, and to actually get yourself queued up is definitely a complicated affair. So I hope to see somehow this get a little easier. Also, the chat system here was pretty fluid as well. I also noticed the voice chat worked super good to know, which was definitely excellent and good to know. This was all very seamless and not too difficult to navigate. Even if you don't have voice chat, you'll be able to pull up a virtual keyboard and chat pretty easily. So kudos here, as this part of the UI was definitely done well and very excellent. As for the performance, this was probably my biggest concern with the launch of a big MMORPG like this. The game is locked at 30 FPS on docked and handheld. You have a vast world to explore, and I mean, you can actually fly from city to city, and I wonder how this game would actually take this huge world, throw in tons of players, and perform. And for the most part, DC Universe Online performed well on the Switch. Now you can tell right away they absolutely toned down the graphics a ton. If you take a look at some of the textures, you can tell it's beyond scaled back. This definitely looked like a PS3 game and not a current gen console game, but I get why they had to do it. This is a huge world with lots of players in it all at the same time. Now they might have downgraded how it looks, but for the most part, questing in the game was absolutely smooth. The thing I wondered the most was how the game would handle the 4-man dungeon situations. If you're not familiar with these dungeons, they are separate instances from the game world that you team up with 3 other players to take on several bosses who drop new gear and loot for you to upgrade your character with. And I was happy to report I had no issues here. There was a lot of effects happening on the screen with these other villains using all their special powers and abilities, and on my screen there was no significant FPS drop or any issues really to report. Now the real question will be how the game holds up in raids, which are 8-man dungeons instead of 4, but I get the feeling that the game's just going to handle it just fine. As for the handheld performance, it held up really well, and was really glad to see there was no issues here to report. The game ran smooth and was locked in at 30 FPS here with no significant drops, even with lots of things happening on my screen. Now I did have my FPS counter up, and at times the game did drop to as low as 8 FPS on certain moments, but this was very, very rare, and if this was anywhere near persistent or even occasional, I would say I have a cause for concern. But I'm happy to report DC Universe Online performance on the Nintendo Switch is about as smooth as you can get for a game this big. As for the free-to-play model and how this game handles this aspect, this was probably my second biggest concern going into DC Universe Online. How would they handle this? Would they nickel and dime their players? Well, I have mixed emotions here. On the surface, it looks like you're getting a pretty free-to-play game. You can level to max level. You don't need to buy experience boosters they have because you do level pretty fast. You can run a lot of the 4-man dungeons without paying, but you'll eventually hit a wall, and you'll have to purchase episodes to continue with more of the stories they have built and unlock more dungeons and raids. This was not something I was excited to see, as having as much content as I saw locked behind a paywall is a bit of a turnoff. You can bypass buying individual pieces of content by paying the standard $15 a month to unlock everything at once, or you can buy things separately by buying Marketplace cash. Keep in mind, paying the $15 is not permanent and only works on a month-to-month basis to have everything unlocked. But even if you buy the $15 a month membership to unlock everything, there is still loot boxes in the game, and I was not happy to see that. You will get these capsules in the game, which are your loot boxes, and you will need to buy stabilizers, which cost 100 market cash to unlock these capsules. These loot boxes only have cosmetic items, so theoretically you don't need this stuff, but I was still disappointed to see a feature like loot boxes in the game, and the fact that there is cool looking cosmetic outfits that I won't be able to access without opening these boxes was definitely a bit disappointing. Ultimately, down the line, if you want to get your character to see more of the story elements and tackle some of the hardest dungeons in this game, you will have to pay money to unlock those individually or bite on the monthly subscription. So you do get a lot of free gameplay here, but to me, because how much content is actually in this game, it's a glorified trial period. Granted, this trial period will see you getting a ton of hours in gameplay without spending a dime, so on the surface it looks good, but ultimately I wasn't happy because there is models out there in other MMORPGs that give you access to everything without paying, and in this game that is not the case. Now, I'm not saying I know the perfect model for a free-to-play game and how you should charge, but I wasn't happy to see so much what looks like to me great content locked behind a paywall. Maybe some of it, maybe a little bit less. I'm not sure what's perfect, but I was definitely disappointed. I'm also not mentioning that there was also powers locked behind the paywall, cosmetic items, legends that you can use for player versus player battles, and a lot more. But with all that said, let's dive into some of the things you can do in DC Universe, and if this game is something that ultimately you want to spend your time and possibly your money on. The game's content, in my opinion, is absolutely excellent, and I had a lot of fun with all the different things you can do. For one, questing will be a huge part of your experience, especially if you only play mostly by yourself. The quests themselves in the world were very basic. You kill some dudes here, turn people evil if you're a villain, or rescue if you're a hero. Almost all the quests followed this basic format, which was completely fine with me, as sometimes these things don't have to be too complicated. For the main missions, they had fully voiced actors in between telling you the story of why you're doing some of the things you're doing. Like I was shutting down a news station in this scenario and destroying news vans as a villain to stop the spread of information. This is a real nice touch here, not something you see with these types of games. After you beat these main quest chains, you'll then get solo mini dungeons to tackle that will feature a boss that drops loot to equip and upgrade your character with. These were completely awesome to do and were a nice touch of the story you were following. I love beating up on Supergirl while she tried to rescue these patients, but instead I was locking them up. This part was awesome and an absolute highlight. Keep in mind you can do these solo dungeons with a buddy or buddies if you desire. There is definitely no restrictions here. The 2 and 4 man dungeons were also a lot of fun. I was impressed with how they handled these dungeons, as they were huge areas to fight and explore with your team. You would have objectives to tackle together as a team, and then you'd face a boss. There was typically 3 to 4 bosses in each of these, and each one would drop loot for you to use. Keep in mind that these are all joinable through the game, as you just go the on duty menu and select what you want to tackle. This game will then match you with other players. You can choose to be one of 3 roles. You can be a healer, which keeps your teammates alive with healing. You can tank, which is also to keep the enemies focused solely on you and keep your heroes or villains safe in your party. Then you have the preferred style of most players, and that is the damage dealers, whose job is to do as much damage as possible and kill your enemies as fast as you can. Last but not least, we have the player versus player mode, which is a game in of its own, and I think there will definitely be some people who flock to this specifically. There is 2 different ways to play this mode, and unfortunately I was not able to do more than a one-on-one, but there is as many as 16 people who can battle it out. You have the one-on-ones, teams of 2-on-2, 4-on-4s, and 8-on-8. I was able to queue a few times in the one-on-one and had a blast here, but that might have been because I won both my encounters. You can also do this in a Legends mode, in which you would choose iconic characters from the DC universe like Batman or Joker and go head-to-head with their own iconic abilities and powers. This player versus player mode ran really well, and the one I was in had specific objectives of being king of the hill. There's tons of different variations of the player versus player mode, but my only concern here as people start to hit level 30 is if a lot of these modes will be relevant, because there is so many that I think won't be used. Sometimes just having too many choices is not a good thing. My final thoughts on DC Universe were mostly positive. For our first big MMORPG on the Nintendo Switch, I was pretty happy. I had a blast questing and following the story. I love creating my villain and outfitting him with his unique special loadout. I love being able to play with some friends and tackle dungeons together. I think you're getting a ton of hours here, even on the free-to-play model, so there's no cost not to give this a shot outside of maybe just storage space. But my final rating of DC Universe Online is a 7.5 out of 10. It didn't get rated higher due to the cash shop being a bit sneaky. I also had to ding it for what are almost 10-year-old graphics, but overall the game is a game you should definitely try, and I think you'll enjoy it, especially if you like superheroes in general. But thank you for watching this video. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts about DC Universe Online here on the Nintendo Switch. If you think this is worth your disk space, if you liked it or you didn't. But if you guys could do me a huge favor, consider clicking the like button, as it helps others find my review. Sub to the channel if you're brand new and you want to see more game reviews, and finally check out my Patreon, as even a $1 donation goes a long way. But with all that said, I hope you all have a sunny day.